Today on Fair Folk at Work, my guest has, first of all, been as an individual a small part of a created collective reality, but she has also been one person creating a reality for many people. I'm talking, of course, about my good friend, Megan Stewart. Hi, Megan.
Hi.
I'll explain that somewhat enigmatic statement as we go along. But first of all, we got to get the traditional Fair Folk at Work questions done. Who was the first person to say to you, let's go to Faire? And what did they say to get you out there?
It was my mom, and we lived in San Bernardino, and it was 1989, which is the first year that the fair came from Devore to San Bernardino. And she said, this thing is happening, and I need some extra work to make money. She was a single parent. And I said, I don't want to go. That sounds dumb, because I was in third grade and everything sounded dumb. And she said, well, you can come with me and there will be other kids to play with, or we can get a babysitter and you can stay home. And so I picked kids to play with, not stay at home with a babysitter, which turned out to be a phenomenal life-altering choice.
Was your mom a vendor?
She was a cook. So her first season at Faire, she worked for turkey legs. And then she went and worked for both Terry at the Boar's Head, and she worked for Bill and Joan at Crepes and Roast Beef. And that was where she stayed for a really long time. So she would work breakfast with Terry. My mom's a hustler. So she worked breakfast with Terry, and then she worked all day with Bill and Joan. And then at night, this is early Devore, and there were so many actors that the fair could support 2 evening coffee houses. So there was Moolah's, and there was also Button Glen had a little mini coffee house, and it was near the main stage.
What did your mom say to you about how you should act at Faire?
Gosh, I'm an extrovert, and I was a very precocious and smart and very outgoing child. And he actually found Children's Guild, which is St. Genesius, and she found them like the first or second day, and sort of walked me over and was like, this is my child. And they had they called them auditions, but I think it was basically like, can you get along with the other kids without like hitting anybody or being rude, and can you do an accent and whatever, and will you play games? It was a raging success. And I think it took me all of 10 minutes to go full Faire brat. That was it. I was in. And I don't think she had to say anything. Although I do have the costumes that you have to wear. I have a silly story about that I love. So Frida Paris Jones, who at the time was just Frida Paris, was, I think, the assistant costume director at the time. Don't quote me. Again, I was a very small child. And my mom, we went over to where she was, and she said, okay, well, she starts talking to me. She says, okay, well, what do you want to wear? Do you want to wear a dress? Do you want to be a princess? And I said, absolutely not. Princesses are stupid. How can I climb a tree in a dress? I'm going to be Robin Hood. She did get me in a dress, but not a princess dress. And that I learned to wear bloomers from Frida, because you can climb a tree in a dress if you're wearing bloomers, because then nobody can see anything. This is the late 80s and early 90s. So being a latchkey kid was not uncommon. So there's like a whole generation of kids who are very independent at a fairly young age, where like nobody drove me to school. I walked. And after school, I went home, and I knew I wasn't allowed to turn the stove on, and I wasn't allowed to make a mess. And I knew what TV shows I was allowed to watch and what TV shows I was not allowed to watch. And I just did what I was supposed to do. Right. So that carries over into Ren Fair. I knew that I was not to go anywhere all by myself. I should always have a friend with me, or a grown-up that I knew and trusted, and that my mom knew and trusted. I knew, don't get in any trouble. Don't get in so much trouble or so much shenanigans that my mom would have another adult come talk to her about me. I think I tried very hard to carry that all the way into adulthood. Not always successfully, but where my guild master would never have to hear about me, or Gerald would never have to have a conversation with me. You can get into trouble, but don't get into amount of trouble that somebody has to talk to you.
I'm sort of fascinated by this. What did you discern as the line to which you would not cross?
Gosh, I was a fairly well-behaved child, but slash and my favorite place to hang out was the washing well. So we had our St. Genesius time, but that wasn't like an all-day thing. And so I would go over to the well and I would climb. There was this huge tree. There's a little bridge, and the well was next to the bridge. And behind the well was this massive spreading oak. And it had a really lovely branch that was the right size for a couple of little girls to climb up and lay on and watch these older women. And they're not older, they're like 16 to 25, to be clear. But when you're like 9 or 10 or 11, like these are women and they know the world. And I would just sit there and watch them and like absorb. And then after, I don't know, a couple weeks of that, I wanted in, right? And I'm like, I want to play too. And they were so welcoming. And so the worst trouble we got into was that, I don't think this was the first year, it was like the second or third year, is that we covered ourselves all in mud, and they brought a couple of us little girls along because there were always little hanger-on little girls around the well. We went over to the court glade and sang God Save the Queen in the stream that ran behind Court Glade at the time, like covered in mud. And we got in a little bit of trouble for ruining some fancy courtly gig. I don't know. I think it was worth it. It's fine. It was funny.
It's funny that you mentioned this, because one of my traditional questions I ask people is, do you think Faire is a good place to raise your kid? And I've had a wide range of responses. Do you know Bailey?
Yeah, I think I don't know her personally, but she's like friends of friends.
She was on the pro side because, first of all, given a wide variety of people to interact with when you're out at Faire. And she also liked that there were people to mentor her kids in both Faire and life in general.
Absolutely.
And that she also liked that it was a place where kids could get a commensurate amount of responsibility. So you could sort of hang out at court, and probably somebody would say, this is what a court kid does. And it sounds like you had that same experience at the washing well, that you were sort of welcomed in. And
no, I agree with you. So I would say I'll call it a mixed bag. I think there are things about Faire as a young woman that I would like to have not experienced, but those things have significantly shifted in recent years to where there is a greater sense of, and this is broadly in our culture as Americans, not just at Faire, like Faire reflects that. And Faire, for me, in many ways, has always been on the vanguard of our culture, especially in California, right? Like when I look back at the history of Faire, and, there were police raids in early Ren Fair, and it was right at the center of this cultural revolution, which is just fascinating to me. And I think a lot of times people underplay that. Ren Fair people don't, but other folks, because Ren Fair is a joke and this, that, and the other. But that Faire has this opportunity and this gift where it is pushing the culture and shifting it. And so that happens with immersive theater, where now all over the place you have these immersive pop-up experiences that are everywhere. Like there's like a Stranger Things experience, there's an Alice in Wonderland experience, there's a speakeasy where you're in an immersive theater space. That is Faire. It's just on a much smaller scale. It's in a more controlled environment. It's semi-scripted, etc. That comes from where we come from. And that's exciting to me. And in that realm, with, I don't want to be negative or anything, but with like the Me Too movement and all of these shifts in our culture, Faire has in many ways taken that opportunity and said, okay, we see that there are some things about the sexual revolution that maybe happened that weren't great. And we want to push those not great things and improve that for everyone. And so where we have workshops now on informed consent at Faire, like that's amazing. So with that caveat, 100%. Because even with experiences that I wish I hadn't had as a young girl at Faire, where people assume you're older than you are, I'm still awesome. I'm fine. I need therapy like everybody else does these days. But that there is something that you get from Faire that you don't see in other kinds of community theater, that you don't see in other kinds of subcultures. And that is that sense of independence within a village where I felt so safe to go run around and be funny. And it is like a sense of theatrical safety where I knew that if I messed up and my joke didn't land, or if I did a gig and I'm like 12, if I did a gig and it wasn't perfect, that I would be not just forgiven for that, but embraced, as this is part of the learning process. And we were all new once. And I think that children at Ren Fair overall, and I don't know if like maybe this is part of the teaching of like, oh, Elizabethan saw kids as tiny adults, or if this is just our subculture, I have no idea. But that you're granted that.
That was baked into the first vestiges of the Faire by Phyllis Patterson and people like Judy Corey. When Faire first started, and I have interviewed Judy, reenaction at the time was like colonial Williamsburg, where you would wander around and you'd watch the village smithy bang a piece of metal. And the other store reenaction at the time was SCA, which was
Right.
people dressing up, drinking mead, and hitting each other with swords.
Yeah. And there's no audience in that situation. You're doing it for each other.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But Phyllis was the one who came up with the idea that it is Fair Day and the Queen is coming, which immediately sets up why we are all here and why we are talking to the patrons. They are fellow visitors coming for market day.
Absolutely.
Another thing that Judy and Phyllis, there was a theater movement at the time which basically said everybody can be an actor. So they built into the notion that nobody can fail. You should interact with the audience, but in a way that they cannot fail. So everybody walks away happy. So it's God ye good den, my lord, my lady, what a beautiful hat you're wearing, what a great pair of sneakers or whatever. And that is just the gestalt, if you will. And people who have never heard of Agora or Phyllis Patterson or Judy Corey are still doing the same stuff. You're right. There is just a welcoming, as long as it's kind of funny and you don't like insult somebody.
Yeah.
You can pretty much, and this is getting back to my opening statement. One of the neat things about the Faire is that it's everybody shares this assumption of why they're there. They create a character that fits into this world that then goes out and deals with all the patrons coming through.
Mm-hmm. We all have a why.
Yes. But what you do when you create an artificial computer environment, you sort of have one person creating this reality and then finding ways to filter it down to the many people who come in.
Yes. Yeah. That's absolutely true. So I work in museum exhibits, right? And so I've worked on a lot of different kinds of exhibits, including a VR exhibit. And there is that exploration of someone else's world versus the opportunity for a world to be constantly changed. And this is interesting because there are some video games that allow you to literally change the landscape, and that's what Faire gives us. And it's very funny to see it like recreated in video game form, right? I think it's such a human impulse to want to see ourselves in a space and to create a change. So I was a director for a while. My husband and I met at Ren Fair, and he's been a director, and there's these vestiges of things that I did 20 years ago that are still happening at Faire. And those refer back to something somebody else did 20 years before that in the 1970s at Faire. And there's these fundamental shifts, but you can still see yourself in the theatrical landscape that we've created, where Phyllis and Judy, like the first year, the queen wasn't there. That wasn't the conceit. But as they started to expand the Fair and it became a larger thing, they're like, we need a unifying story. What's the story? Okay, it's this. And then that's just, when did the Lord Mayor join? And then the Puritans were created, right? And then this group is added, and these fundamental landscape shifts that they just keep continuing on. And you can, as an individual in this massive group of people, where there are thousands of people who exist in our subculture, just in the California fairs, where you can still see the ripple of your having been there once. This version of a version of a version of a funny gig you did, that it still exists somewhere, that there's a piece of it. I was in the Court of Misrule at Southern and Northern Renaissance Pleasure Fair. And we had a very silly gig that a pair of brothers came up with, Matt and Paul, and they had a chicken doll and a duck doll, and they were like those muslin rag dolls, and they sewed them together, and they said that they were the conjoined animal, and its name was Chuck the Chicken Duck. The Court of Misrule went all in on Chuck the Chicken Duck. There was the Ballad of Chuck the Chicken Duck, which was many pages long in quatrain form. It's a beautiful, epic poem of the battle between the chickens and the ducks. There was a song, which is a short song. So the last time I was the director of the Court of Misrule was in 2004, 5? That's a while ago, right? It's 2023 now. And 2 years ago, I was on Facebook, and someone who's in the Court of Misrule now mentioned Chuck the Chicken Duck. And I was like, how? There is no through line. Not a single person who is in the group right now was in the group when I was in the group. It's so silly, and it's such a silly game, but that's 5 years ago. And there's still this hint of it, and it's still this funny thing that happens. And that's amazing. And Faire is different because it is not fundamentally the same show. It's the same framework, but the show is different. The show is different every hour of every day, of every year, of every decade that it's been on. And that's because of us. And that's amazing as an art form to have this.
I and my good friend Mark Selden, we've written many shows for Faire. And the other day, there was a video, A Tale of Good King Arthur, and it's a rhyming show. And whoever was filming this about 3 or 4 years ago caught somebody doing our show. And I honestly didn't recognize it because they were doing it. We did it sort of as bumbling peasants. And that was sort of the gestalt that the show was sort of meant to be, because it's a rhyming show. It's very childlike. But these guys decided to do it like a drill team. I mean, it was very precise and it was very clean, and I didn't recognize it. And then I went, this sounds vaguely familiar. And then I went, wait a minute, I think he's doing my part. And he was doing it completely different. And I felt good about that.
Yeah.
Because I think the fact that you created something that somebody else could take and have it become theirs and do it live in front of an audience when you can't anymore, I think is just great.
It is. It's a gift in many ways. And
To shift gears slightly, how in a 3D computer environment can you sort of replicate that? Let me share with you my conception of what you do.
oh, okay.
Now, this perception is basically 30 years old, and it comes from when I was in library school in 1990. It seemed to me what was going on was a massive form of if-then statements. So if the character comes here, then this happens. So what I see you doing in a museum setting is you say you want to go to the moon or something like that. And then so you create a series of if-then statements that give the user an on the moon experience. How off am I?
Not far off. I mean, similar to Faire's is that you have different kinds of museum experiences, right? So my primary work has been in the science center and science museum realm versus art museum. But I do work in these science centers and science museums. And so science center versus science museum, a science museum is usually something like a natural history museum or the computer history museum, something like that, where they own a collection and they have objects, right? That they maintain. A science center is a place where you can interact with exhibits to learn about usually physical science, because that's the easiest thing to interact, to build, right? So there's a lot of history about science centers, but if you think about the Exploratorium in San Francisco, that was one of the very first science centers that was ever built. It is in this fundamental idea that through play, you can teach people. Sounds familiar about Ren Faire a little bit. And it is that same era, right? So science centers were born in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, like where they're coming of age. And there's also OMSI in Oregon was one of the very first pioneers also.
I interned once at the Children's Museum in Los Angeles when I was in college.
Oh, that was such a good place. Yeah.
And that really was, and I hadn't thought of this before, Faire kind of the idea that you can learn through play. Like they had the shadow wall that was fun. The idea was that you got it flashed and then immediately your shadow was displayed.
Yeah. And so they have that exhibit, and it makes me think of Faire. So that exhibit, right, the shadow wall, then became one where they could do it with multiple colors. So as you would dance, it would flash your silhouette in colors, like trailing behind you. And then that became a 3D sensor that could see you in real time and display a dot map of you. This same simple concept of an exhibit of like, oh, here's your shadow and here it's reflected on the wall, has grown and changed and grown and changed. And there's so much parallel between this idea of learn to play in the Science Center world and in the Ren Faire. I'm an exhibits project manager, and I have worked on a lot of things that are varied. So everything from a super simple mechanical interactive to a VR environment, right? They're all very different, but they have the same principle, which is free choice learning. And it's this idea of a different style of learning than what you experience in school. Because what we experience in school is guided learning. It is not our choice what we are learning about that day. And free choice learning does have some roots in the Ren Faire. And so these two things come together, and it's what I get so excited about. So, and I remember Phyllis used to talk about this, and I was young, but she talked about tricking people into learning about Shakespeare, right? They come to Ren Faire to eat turkey legs and drink beer, and they go home talking about Hamlet. How do you do that? How does that happen? And they go home and they buy season tickets for their local Shakespeare company. Or they're a teenager. Like I remember reading Romeo and Juliet in 9th grade. And I'm there and I'm like, I can read this perfectly because I have taken Elizabethan language classes since I was in 3rd or 4th grade. I can speak this language. It's fine. But there is so much discomfort around the language. And so our teacher offered they would do extra credit if you went to the Ren Fair and watched a show. Because it's that idea, that immersive learning, where what if Shakespeare comes to life? Who is Juliet? What is she really like? And I think the same thing happens in museums, in good museums.
One of the criticisms I was going to give was that, and this has perhaps been answered already, if you're live, you can sort of downshift if you have a child. If you have a 17-year-old with his girlfriend who's 17 also, you can go someplace else. And if your audiences are 25 to 30 and they're drunk off their asses, you can go someplace else. What is your way of dealing with that as a museum center?
So you're right. So the difference is that an exhibit is static, right?
Right.
Is you build it and it stays. And it stays for anywhere from, it depends on the type of museum, the type of exhibit. So anywhere from, we're going to say like 2 weeks for experience kind of things, like seasonal overlays, whatever, to 10 years. It's the same exhibit. And you do have to build it thinking about how multiple levels of audiences, and how you have to be a little bit of a futurist, because you have to think about how will people's interactions with this content change over time.
I think you have an out. By the way they play, they engender a reaction that is appropriate to them. Anybody can jump up and down, but a 4-year-old jumping up and down is going to interact with it fundamentally different than a 30-year-old, say, will jump up and down. And the 30-year-old might see how the interaction with the colors go, and they'll begin to create something. And so I think that the play aspect is what really makes it different.
I think a really good way to look at it is that a really good science center experience leaves you with questions, and it leaves you excited to learn more. You're not going to get all of the information that you know exists about something from a 24 by 36 panel.
Right.
It's not going to happen. And also, most people don't read the 24 by 36 panel. That is a fact. There's this concept, it's from Tim Kirk, who was an Imagineer, and that there are 3 kinds of people who interact in a space. You have waders, you have swimmers, and you have divers. So waders are people who they just go in the waves a little bit and they come back out. They're surface level. So if you think about a museum exhibit, like a whole themed environment, and they're walking around, they're going to kind of just walk through and they're going to let it wash over them, right? And then you have a swimmer, and a swimmer is a kind of person who's going to they're going to swim over to that one and they'll read that, and then they'll back away, and then they're going to go over here and they'll swim over to that one. And so they're moving back and forth in this space, and they'll read half a panel. They'll be like, oh, I get this. And then they move on. And then you have a diver, and the diver is going to go through, they are looking for treasure, right? So they're going through the whole exhibit. They're reading every label. They're looking at every object. They're playing with every interactive. So divers are maybe 10% of your audience. Maybe. You have that at Faire too, if you think about it, right? In, I don't know, the middling days of Faire, they had those paper ribbons that guests could pin on their clothes to identify them. So they were purple is a royal person and green is a peasant. I think yellow was the fools. And so you knew right away, if somebody had one of those pinned on, you knew which kind of person they were. And this maps almost perfectly to the same idea, waiter, swimmer, diver, right? If a person has the purple ribbon, if they have a ribbon at all, they are ready to play.
Yes. If
they refuse the ribbon, they're shy, they don't want it, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Some people just want to be in this space and not interact with the space. And then you had the purple ribbon and you're like, okay, this person wants me to go up to them and they want me to say, well, good, your grace.
Yeah.
And then they want to move on. If you found somebody with a fool ribbon or a peasant ribbon, they are your divers. Those are the people that want to play. Those people are there. They are in, they are for it. And you see the same thing in Ren fairs today. If somebody comes to Faire in jeans and a t-shirt, they're going to have fun, but you can make a guess. They're probably a swimmer. They're not a waiter. They're there. They're going to play some games, whatever. If they come in a fancy princess dress, you know what they want from you. And if they come in their favorite cosplay and you walk up to them and you know what they're dressed as, the fox spirit from this anime, and you can say that to them, but in Ren Faire, they are going to be thrilled and think that this is the best day of their lives, right? But the same thing happens in museums. So you have content, right? So if you think about the last time you went to a museum exhibit, there's a big title that tells you what the exhibit's about. There's a subtitle that tells you the focus of the exhibit. And then you have big panels, and those graphics have a lot of dense information, but you could skim it, read the first paragraph, kind of get what they're trying to tell you. And then you have the micro labels for each little thing. And that's it. And the same thing happens at fairs. And it's the same thing over and over again. I think it's like this fundamental human thing, right? Some people really want to know. They really want to interact. They really want to play. They really want to read all the labels. And it's the same kind of person. And so taking what I learned at Ren Faire about human beings and just apply that to museums. And it's not difficult. It's not like it's rocket science what I do. It does play to that fundamental humanity that we all share, that this curiosity about the world.
I found when I was a librarian, I used Faire. When you said the questions, they use questions. And I did an exhibit at the local Pasadena Museum of History.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the same thing. It was a 50 question. And if the question was there, and if they wanted to know the answer, they could, there was a pull down menu kind of thing.
Nice.
So you got a lot of history in there, but it was, you sort of hooked them. And then in explaining the answer, you basically got the whole idea.
You're engaging their curiosity instead. Yeah. That's a brilliant way of doing it, right? And I think that falls into museum best practices in general, right? There have been studies about like, how do people react to different kinds of labels on especially on interactive pieces in museums. And interactives are a great way to sneak people into learning. We know that from Ren Faire. So you can ask a person a question, you can make a suggestion of what they should do, or you can mix the two, right? So if you're playing with a marble, you can say, what happens when you put the marble in the hole? And people hate that. They hate question-only exhibits, right? They like it when there's a hint. And if you just say, put the marble in the hole, then you take away the free choice aspect of the learning, where they're solving the problem, right? And that's what you want them to do. You want them to solve the problem themselves, because then they are more connected to the answer. So if you say, can you get the marble in the hole? Try using the tongs. I don't know. Those two together, you ask a question, you offer a little bit of the answer, and then they feel triumphant. They love everything about it. That happens at Ren Faire. Good day, my lord. How art thou? Too much. They're scared, right? They're like, I'm fine, thanks. And they're going to leave. Good day, my lord. How art thou? I am so excited to see the queen. Do you have your best dress on? I don't know, like something like that. So you're guiding the conversation in the direction you'd like it to go. And that's what we learn from Faire. And I think it's funny because I meet a lot of people who are like, oh, I don't do improv. That's not my thing. I'm an environmental person. Oh, I just work in a booth. Oh, I'm just this. I'm just that. Every single conversation that you have ever had in your life has been improvised. All of them. All of them. Even if you researched and practiced and decided what you were going to say in advance, it never goes the way you think. Even if you did that, because you're like, I'm going to go and I'm going to give my elevator pitch, and then he's going to say this, and then I'm going to say that, and then we're going to have a handshake deal, and I'm going to get my company funded. That never happens. It doesn't happen the way you rehearse it, because there's another human being on the other end of the conversation who is unpredictable. So everyone improvises 100% of the time. We're improvising right now. We didn't know how this conversation was going to go. That's amazing. And we can guide our conversations, right? Like you ask me a question and then you add a suggestion onto it. And that's so normal to us. And I think it's a funny thing that people are so intimidated by improv when they do it every time they go to the grocery store. Like, how are the apples today? They're actually not bad, but there's a sale on blueberries. You should get those instead.
I'm going to add on to that by saying I have written a musical. I have written music knowing absolutely nothing about music. I have never taken a music class. And so I said to myself, notes are just conversations that you've planned. A note, it either can go up, it can either go down, or it can stay the same. You put enough of them together, you have a song, and black keys are funny. And so with this principle, I wrote a musical.
I love that.
I think I took music in the 7th grade, and I knew there was a correlation between where the dot was on the music and where it was supposed to sound like.
Mm-hmm.
And so you just put dots on sheet music, and then with a computer, you can play it back and you go, that's really good, or that's close. But the idea is that you sort of do something, then get the feedback, and then you can refine it.
Yeah.
Which is a skill you can get out at Faire.
I love that. Oh, I think a lot about music.
Mm-hmm.
I have very little formal training, but I've been in a folk band, which is funny. I am terrified of auditions. The last time I tried to audition for something with singing, I can get up and do a monologue fine, but with singing, I almost fainted the last time I went to a singing audition. In the middle of it, I had to sit down. But I have this belief that all humans are musical. And like you noted, even people who don't sing, their voices are musical. Their voices go up and down, or they're quiet or they're loud, depending on the situation, right? This is part of who we are. And I think that Faire gives us a place where it's okay to sing with each other again. And that's something between like the advent of radio forward that was kind of taken away from us, right? Where we don't sing with each other and when we're walking down the road anymore, because now we drive and there's radio. Right. And Faire gives that back to us. And I love that so much. And I love breaking music rules, because the music rules are made up. And exactly. Like, especially in Western music, they were invented literally by a very small group of European white guys a very long time ago, and no shade on them. We have a really interesting and cool music system. But before that, there was a different music system. And in other cultures, there are different musical systems, and they're all amazing and beautiful, all of them. And if you can hack our musical system using modern technology, that is like the best thing ever. So I have dyscalculia. It's like dyslexia, but for numbers. But it's not a one-to-one comparison. Like I don't necessarily write numbers backward, but sometimes I'll flip them in my head, but more in a broader sense. And I also have ADHD. But so I have a very poor sense of time. And I really struggle with extremely abstract concepts like math or music theory. Music, singing is real. It's not abstract. Dots on a paper is not real. And so I struggle really badly with that, right? And I think that some of that struggle and what you're talking about with practicing what you're going to say, and then the other person, you have to give them time to hear you and react. So that 4 feet sounds amazing to me because with the ADHD, I take longer to process auditory information, right? So I have to remember to pause, because otherwise I'll just keep asking you like, what'd you say? Huh? And I know, but it just took my brain a minute to catch up to what I heard already. Improv doesn't have to be scary, and it doesn't have to be funny, and it doesn't have to be a big deal. Improv is just, I'm going to say hello to every person I meet today as I'm walking down the street while I'm walking my dog, and then we'll see what happens from there. Because I would bet that not on all of your walks, but on some of your walks, the person you say, hey, your dog's really cute, and that was the thing you knew you were going to say today, that they go, oh, thank you, and they stop walking.
Right.
And then you have a conversation. And then what kind of dog is he? How long have you had your dog? Is he friendly? May I pet him? And then you've had a whole improvised conversation based on a single phrase that you practiced. That's it. The same thing happens at Faire. You can walk down the street being like, my lord, my lord, my lord, my lord. And then you go, my lord, to my guy. He's like, hey, what's up? Happy Ren Fair today. I'm so excited. I have yield nachos, yield beer. I like your dress, right? You're having this awesome conversation with someone who's so excited to be there. And all you practiced for your improv was, my lord, good day, whatever.
Do you, in the Faire or life environment, how do you wrap your head around being in a singing group versus a one-on-one improv?
Oh, they're the same thing. I think they're the same thing because what they require is listening.
Okay.
Right? So if you are singing with other people, the number one most important thing you're doing is listening to the people around you to make sure you're tied in with them, because you have practiced your piece of music until you sing it in your sleep. Like it's just rote. It's just there, right? And you know how to do it, and it's fine and it's easy. And then you take that and you add in other humans and you rehearse together, right? And you rehearse as best you can. And then you take that and you drop it into the middle of the Faire. Good luck. Right? It's so loud. There's so much going on. It's dusty. The audience is hollering at you or they want to join in, and you have to, in order to be able to embrace the opportunities that an environment like Ren Fair gives you, you have to listen. You cannot walk around or you cannot stand and sing with others without listening. What's happening with Joe on my left? Oh, I see. He's responding. The guitar's a half step out of tune today. Okay. If we all went and sang the way we were supposed to sing, right? The way we rehearsed, the guitar's a half step out of tune. What is the audience experience? It's so unpleasant, right? As a singer, if there's a single instrument, as a singer, if you can match that tone, the audience will never know because it's harmonious. It's fine because you're all singing together. That is one of the benefits also of singing a cappella, right? When there's no instrument, if everybody wanders out of tune eventually, which happens frequently, as long as you all do it together, it's not accurate, but also you're outdoors and you're having fun and you're drinking beer or yeah, exactly. Whatever. But it's the same thing with improv, right? You have to listen to the people around you. The same thing happens if you're in a scripted stage show, right? So a couple years ago, we did a condensed version of Merry Wives. We all knew our lines. We all had our blocking, but things happen in live theater. Somebody fumbles, somebody forgets a line, somebody trips as they're walking in, and you have to be paying attention. If you, as an actor, walked through your scene and said all your lines at the exact same point that they always did, but the guy who's in your scene fell on his face as he was walking in, like, you have to get the scene back on its feet. And the only way you can do that is if you're paying attention and listening and caring about the people around you. That's true of improv. That's true of audiences. That's true of singing. That's true of museums. The only way that you can get information across to someone is by caring about them and thinking about how they will receive it and thinking about what's the best way to share this information with the public in a way that is universal, in a way that is digestible? Can they chew this little chunk? Or are they going to be standing here trying to eat a tough steak for 10 minutes? Like, how many languages do you translate it into? Do you have pictures also so that they know what to do with their hands? That goes into accessibility and thinking about accessibility in a much broader sense. But because Faire, aside from the dirt, does tend to try to find ways to adapt to accessibility for every individual, you learn that, and then you can take it to wherever you work. It doesn't matter. You don't have to work in a museum to take listening to people and giving them what they need and answering their questions. You could do that in literally any work in the entire world. That applies everywhere.
Yes. Well, I think I've run out of words. And so to conclude, we are going to do an improv thought experiment.
Okay.
Congratulations. You have just won the Phyllis Patterson Award for Lifetime Achievement in Faire stuff. The band has been told to sit on their instruments, and you can take as long as you like. So give me your acceptance speech.
Without Ren Faire, I would not be the person that I am today. I would not have the marriage that I have today. I would not have the career that I have today. And I would not have the friends that I have today. And so for whatever I have given the Ren Faire, it has given me back 1,000-fold, more than I ever could have dreamed when I was a little girl in a blueberry costume, head to toe, in a little pink snood. I never, ever would have imagined the gift that Faire has been to me. And I hope that other little girls listening to this and thinking about this will say yes to Ren Faire and will come out and will have the magical, amazing experiences that I have had that are full of love and joy and listening for the rest of their lives.
That was my January 2023 interview with Megan Stewart. If you have questions or comments you'd like me to forward to Megan Stewart, you can email them to me at djng@earthlink.net. Questions or comments about the podcast itself can be directed to me also at djng@earthlink.net. Finally, if you or somebody you know would like to be a guest on Fair Folk at Work, contact me at djng@earthlink.net. That's it for this time. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.